Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Kelly's webinar on Saturn transits today. This is actually kind of a part two from a series that she started up last month on Saturn. So if you missed that one, you can tune in. You'll still be able to follow along with this one, even if you missed that one. But if you are enjoying today's webinar and you didn't pick up the first one, I'll find that link and drop it in the chat window for you. But thanks so much for joining us again, Kelly. I'm excited to see your presentation today.
Thanks so much, Tony. And thanks to everyone who is joining us. Yeah, we did the Saturn transits through the houses last month. So we went through each house and talked a little bit about what Saturn in that house might mean. And today we're going to focus on the visible or the traditional planets and look at what Saturn transiting those planets might indicate or bring up in your lives based on your chart. So we still have a fair bit of material to get through. So I'm not going to talk about transiting Saturn in aspect to natal Saturn. So we're not looking at Saturn returns and things like that today. Instead, we're going to look at transiting Saturn in aspect to your natal sun, your natal moon, your natal Mercury, natal Venus, natal Mars, and natal Jupiter. And I'm going to share some theory and also a brief example. We've got examples, I think, for almost every planet. So time pending, we'll be able to go through those as well. And of course, we'll have some time for questions at the end. So with that said, let us begin. So I'll get the presentation up. There we go. Okay, so I wanted to begin with a quote by Rumi, because so much of one of the things I wanted to share through this series, or this sort of two-part training on Saturn, was to talk a little bit about the importance of transits from Saturn, how much you're going to use them in your practice, how important they are in terms of tracking in your own chart. And a great way to really get to know Saturn better is by following Saturn transits. I was talking about this with a group of students in my timing courses earlier this week about how you learn a lot about the birth chart and you get a level of understanding about your natal chart. But when you go further into timing and predictive astrology, what you learn there feeds back into helping you understand the way a birth chart works as well. So this is going to be hopefully building your relationship and your understanding of the essence of Saturn. So hopefully we'll be able to, cover off some of the main theory, but go a little bit beyond that. And one quality that I think is very Saturnian is the quality of deliberation. And this short extract of a poem by Rumi speaks a little bit to what I think we're all working with in some way, shape, or form when we are in a Saturn transit. And this quote, this little passage, I've got an extract of it on the screen, but I think I'll read you the full passage. So the full passage starts, "A friend remarks to the prophet, 'Why is it that I always make bad business deals? It's like a spell. I become distracted by business talk and get led into the wrong decisions.' Muhammad replies, 'Stipulate with every transaction that you need 3 days to make sure.' Deliberation is one of the qualities of God. Throw a dog a bit of something and he'll sniff to see if he wants it. Be that careful. Sniff with your wisdom nose. Get clear and then decide." The universe came into being gradually over 6 days. God could have just commanded, "Be." Little by little, a person reaches 40 and 50 and 60 and feels more complete. And one of the things, there's a few pieces I love about this passage. I just love the concept of having a wisdom nose and sniffing and using that for our decisions. But what this passage is sort of indicating is that some of the decisions we make that we might come to later regret come out of situations where we don't take the time to reflect or check in with ourselves. We're making decisions under pressure or because we're not concentrating or what have you. And so there's something here about whenever you can, and you're in a big Saturn transit, giving yourself some time and space. And when we get into exploring some of the myth and meaning of Saturn as we go through these transits today, it's going to become a little bit more clear just how important deliberation, like space or energy or time to to deliberate with events, when you're in a Saturn transit. So that's part of our inspiration as we begin today. Now, there are some common themes or common qualities or the tone of being in a Saturn transit that we're going to discuss. And this would apply to specific topics as indicated by the specific natal planet receiving the transit, but there is some common ground here. And we're talking about Saturn transits in the context of primarily Saturn making things like a conjunction, a square, or an opposition to the planets in your birth chart. There is a piece where, yes, there are some subtle differences between like Saturn square a natal planet or Saturn opposite a natal planet, but there are some very common themes. If Saturn is square your natal Mars or opposite your natal Mars, there's a whole breadth of descriptive and predictive material that you can use in both scenarios. So it's beyond the scope of our time here together to get into the differences of like Saturn conjunct a planet versus square a planet. But in my experience, if you can understand how to interpret Saturn transiting that planet, you'll be able to apply that to any specific aspect that's going on. Clients often report feeling a heaviness or this quality of being weighed down when they're in a Saturn transit. And that can show up in some different ways. It could be a physical heaviness of being tired or sore in the body. It can be an emotional or a psychological heaviness of feeling a pressure to manage a lot of things or to make some big decisions. But that quality of being kind of carrying a weight that is heavier is very common. Saturn's qualities as a planet are the qualities of coolness or cold and dry or dryness. And each of those qualities tells us something about the way that we are most likely to engage with life and events when we're in a Saturn transit. If the cool quality is associated with slowing down, it's associated with stillness or moving at a more measured, manageable pace, we might say. And so if you feel like you're dealing with maybe delays or limitations in a Saturn transit, it may be a clue that prior to that, you had been moving a little too quickly, and to go deep and to really do the restructuring that the Saturn transit is indicating, you may have to go slower. You may have to focus on fewer things. One of the big phrases that I say a lot for clients with Saturn transits is that this is a cycle about quality, not quantity. So when we're in a Saturn transit, we have to somehow restructure or make changes so that we are focused on fewer things, but more important things. And sometimes to figure that out, we have to pause or slow down. The dryness of Saturn creates space and a quality of separateness. And sometimes we're in situations where we have an appropriate amount of space and then we end up with more than that. And when we have an excess of separateness, we can end up with things like feeling lonely or isolated. Sometimes when we're in a Saturn transit, we're so in something or so entangled with a person or a situation that we can't think straight or see clearly anymore. And so when you're in that type of situation and a Saturn transit shows up, the pulling back or the turning within that the Saturn transit indicates can actually help you get a broader perspective or a more honest perspective. So while it can, of course, be difficult to deal with feelings of loneliness or isolation, it is sometimes from being back or away from other people or other things that we can get a sense of the fullness of the situation, the truth of the situation, or the reality of the situation. So it might not feel great in the moment, but it may create a situation where you can come to an understanding that you couldn't previously. One totally underrated thing that I believe Saturn transits do is they create clarity. They help you see things as they are, not as you'd like them to be or what their potential could be. And sometimes when we get really honest with ourselves about what is or isn't working, or about the truth of something that happened in the past, it can help us prioritize, can help us figure out what our priorities perhaps could be. One thing with Saturn transits is they often help you update so that your priorities and your commitments are relevant to your current circumstances rather than the circumstances that you might have had 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 7 years ago. One of the things I think we all find the most difficult of working through in a Saturn transit is this quality of making necessary choices. And when I say necessary choices, Saturn is a real no muss, no fuss kind of planet. And he is not interested in excess or frivolity. He's interested in the essentials. What are your core requirements to do with safety or security or protection or preservation? And sometimes we lose track of those because we are focused on the bright, shiny things. And in a Saturn transit, we're called back to make some of those important choices. Now, making a choice or making a decision is not something that many of us modern humans enjoy. We prefer to leave our options open or to figure out how to have many things rather than choose the one or two things that will be most nourishing or most meaningful for us. And so one of the things that I think can be a bit of a source of angst or stress in a Saturn transit is that you find yourself in a situation where you simply cannot continue to keep all your options open, time-wise or energy-wise or financially, and you have to make a choice. Part of this choice making is an invitation to embrace the reality of the situation that you're in. And the embracing the reality goes back to some of these features about being honest, being clear, seeing it as it is. And as we do that, that weaves us into a really practical expression of Saturn transits, which has to do with time management skills. So as we get more honest about how much we can do in a day, whether that's with family or our jobs or our health and fitness, we start to realize that we start to get a clearer sense of what we can do in an hour, what we can do in a day, what we can do in a week. And sometimes it's less than what we thought. But that honesty and that clarity can help us make those choices about which things should go into the schedule or the plan and which things that should more realistically be left out. And this all feeds into one of the biggest internal growth pieces that I think we get out of Saturn transits, that it teaches us about our sense of ourself. And it is an opportunity to develop a clearer set of rules or boundaries in terms of how we interact with the world at large. And Saturn is the planet that wants to consolidate our energy and effort behind the people or projects that are most important to us. And to do that, we have to get better at saying no to the many extra invitations or offers that, or the demands on our time and energy that we deal with every day and every week. And if you take nothing else from today, one way to transform your experience of a Saturn transit is to start saying no a lot more often. No, I won't be able to help you out with that. I'd love to, but I'm unavailable. I'm so sorry that that's gone on and that you're having to manage that. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to contribute. It's really difficult to do, but it is part of developing and firming up this sort of energetic backbone or this internal sense of firmness about what is important to you and how, if you're saying yes to the things that are important to you, it will not be possible to say yes to other things as well. So one thing we do in a Saturn transit is we shift our sense of what's important away from external demands or constructs and towards internal things. And so when you're dealing with choices or changes or practical matters in a Saturn transit, I want you to think about, is this because this other person or situation wants something from me? Or is this because I have decided this is important for me? So that's some things to think about with Saturn themes as we're getting started. Now, I also wanted to make a mention, I know students often get a little worried about having a Saturn transit. And that's reasonable. It's going to be an effortful time where we're not going to escape without having to put some work in to one thing or another. But I wanted to make sure you were all aware that we have Saturn transits on a fairly often or frequent schedule. Saturn will make one of these dynamic or more dramatic aspects by transit to each planet in your chart every 7 years. For instance, if Saturn is conjunct or square your sun now, 7 years in the future, Saturn might be square or opposite your sun. And then 7 years on from that, Saturn will come back and make another one of those aspects, either the conjunction, the square, or the opposition. So that every 7 years, you're having to do some of this Saturnian work about the sun and the sun stuff in your birth chart. The same thing is going on with, say, Venus in your chart, where every 7 years, Saturn is either conjunct or square or opposite Venus in your own personal chart. And as Saturn does that, you've got the Saturn transit to your natal Venus journey and the Saturn transit to your natal Sun journey, but they're not happening necessarily on the same 7-year cycle. So the key with working with any timing cycles, but particularly Saturn, which is our focus today, is to identify which part of my birth chart is being drawn into the Saturnian grip at this point in time. And it won't affect every topic in your life, but if you get a deep understanding of your natal planet that is receiving the Saturn transit, it can let you know where to put your effort and your time and your concentrated thinking and planning for the timeline of the Saturn transit. Now, some Saturn transits are what we call a one-hit wonder, where they might be 3 or 4 weeks where the transiting Saturn is exactly in aspect to your natal planet. But most transiting Saturn aspects last about 8 to 9 months, where transiting Saturn will make a direct aspect to your natal planet, a retrograde aspect to your natal planet, and then a direct aspect to your natal planet by exact degree. And those 3 activations will be about 4 weeks of time each and happening 3 in an 8 or a 9 month period. So when you're having a Saturn transit to a planet in your birth chart, it's not necessarily something that's going to take up even a whole year of your life, but it is going to demand your full attention and energy and best effort for that 8 to 9 month period. Now, just before we get into Saturn transiting the planets themselves, I want to take a moment to make sure we really get a good sense of the natal planet that is being affected or changed by Saturn. When we're talking about Saturn transits, we're talking about transits that are marking these essential points on our journey to maturity. Saturn transits are times in our lives where we can gain wisdom, hard-won wisdom that we get through lived experience, through grappling with stuff that might confront or scare us a little bit, through exploring our vulnerability and the kind of edge between being vulnerable and being firm. Developing patience is a huge thing that Saturn tries to teach us. And one thing that we all learn to do in varying ways through a Saturn transit is to start to understand how close the faraway future really is, so that we make choices in the present that don't just make us feel better today, but will provide us some type of reward or gift in the future. So there's a change in sort of time frame and priority and perspective when we're in a Saturn transit. We stop thinking about, is this good for today or tomorrow? And we start thinking about, how is this helping me build something for the future? Or if it's not helping you build something for the future, that's going to be your clue about what needs attending to and restructuring. A Saturn transit is about taking that slow time to digest and to deliberate. So you don't have to rush with your choices. You've got this 8 to 9 month time frame, but you do need to think about, what are you going to adjust as you go through. Okay, so we're just going to come straight through to this natal planet section, where I wanted to give you some things to think about. And when we get into our examples, we'll be addressing some of these. So these are points to consider about the natal planet that is receiving the Saturn transit and has to figure out how to respond to Saturn. So this is all natal chart, interpretive stuff. And we don't have time to teach you all of these today. So this is a little bit of assumed knowledge. Or if there are some terms or familiars here that terms or phrases that you're not familiar with here, that could be something to add into your astrology toolbox as we move forward. I will show you these things in action in the examples. And many of you, if you're not familiar with it, will be able to put things together from there. But I wanted to honor our intention to talk about the timing component of Saturn today. So this is what I'm keeping in mind as I interpret a Saturn transit in the context of a birth chart. And so things you want to think about, first of all, identify which planet in your chart is being transited by Saturn. So is transiting Saturn aspecting your moon or your Mercury or your sun, for instance? What are the general topics of that planet? For instance, the moon might be about emotions and family, or Mercury might be about communication. What are the chart specific topics that that planet is responsible for? And that's a technique we use a lot in ancient forms of astrology that has to do with house rulership. And we're going to see this in action in a number of our examples today. What this basically means is that if transiting Saturn is in aspect to the moon in your chart, in addition to the regular moon topics that you'll want to include in your prediction for that transit, you will also want to acknowledge how this transit will affect the topics of the Cancer house in the chart. So if transiting Saturn is in aspect to the natal moon, that is going to affect the houses that the moon is responsible for, which is the house where the moon sign of Cancer is. You can also think about how important is the planet receiving the Saturn transit in the context of your birth chart. The ascendant ruling planet is a really important planet in ancient astrology chart interpretation, and it becomes important in timing. And another planet known as the sect light, which is basically the sun in a day chart and the moon in a night chart, is also very important. And I'm going to show you a couple of things here with these examples we've got coming up. What condition is the natal planet in your chart in? And that describes whether you're more likely to deal with a difficult experience through the Saturn transit, or whether you're more likely to get a great outcome from the Saturn transit. And we have a couple of charts that will help illustrate that as well. So all of these points about the natal planet in your chart receiving the transit is going to influence the kinds of things that happen, whether you get a more productive, constructive experience or outcome of the Saturn transit, or whether you get some of the more classically difficult or uncomfortable Saturn transit experience. So these are the things that I'll hold in my mind. And we're going to pop in to one example quite quickly right now, just to have a little look at some of these theories in action so you can see what I'm talking about. Okie dokie. So this is a client's chart, and we've worked together for a long time. And over that time, they've had a variety of different Saturn transits. And I want to tell you a little bit of a tale about the difference between two of the Saturn transits that they've experienced. And this will help illustrate some of the theories about the topics connected to each planet and how the condition of the natal planet factors in to the experiences. So going back to 2015, when transiting Saturn was in the sign of Sag, this individual had transiting Saturn go over Mercury in their chart. So they have natal Mercury in Sag at 2 degrees. And there was a period of time in 2015 where Saturn was kind of bouncing over 2 degrees Sag. And for this individual, this was a very, very stressful time. They were dealing with an incredibly difficult individual in their workspace, and it caused a lot of mental health stress for them. There was also an issue going on with a friend of theirs who was dealing with their own demons, and that was creating a real heaviness for this individual. At the same time, this individual was also struggling with a difficult financial situation where they were struggling to kind of manage their finances and get on top of some of their loan repayments and things like that. So how do we get all of those topics out of this Saturn conjunct Mercury transit? Well, we know it's going to affect something to do with money, income, and possibly work because it's happening inside the second house. We know it's going to affect the mind and the mental state and communication because it's a Saturn transit to Mercury. The topic of friendship comes in because in this chart, one of Mercury's signs, Virgo, is on the 11th house cusp. And so the Saturn Mercury transit is bringing up stuff going on with the 11th house. And the other Mercury ruled sign, Gemini, is on the 8th house cusp, which is the part of the chart that deals with debts and loans and financial matters along those lines. What made this such a difficult time for this individual? The condition of natal Mercury. Mercury in Sagittarius is technically in a condition known as detriment. And so Saturn conjunct or square or opposite a planet that is in detriment in the chart is one of those indicators that is more likely to lead to a more stressful or difficult period. What was really interesting is that the pressures or the difficulties kind of went hand in hand with the Saturn Mercury transit. You might also, if you're quite sharp-eyed, realize that as Saturn continued moving through Sag, it would also make a square back to Mars in Virgo in this chart. And so some of the pressures and stresses to do with friends or to do with even the mind, because Mars is in Virgo, they did continue a little bit on the timeline of the Saturn-Mars transit. And so from the lived experience of the client, the time frame of Saturn conjunct Mercury and Saturn square Mars was these periods of more kind of distress or discomfort where life was just harder for them to manage, particularly in some of these specific ways for those times. I wanted to use a chart like this. I know it's speaking to when Saturn was in Sag, but we're talking about Saturn transiting the planets, and these theories and ideas will apply regardless of the signs. And I know at the moment, as we're recording this, transit Saturn is in Aquarius. And so some of you will have planets in Aquarius and maybe also in Taurus. And so you're looking at the different timelines of Saturn in Aquarius to your natal planet there, and then Saturn from Aquarius squaring your planet in, say, Taurus. So just to be keeping in mind that one transit can kind of run into another occasionally based on our natal chart. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of that, and also why it was so difficult, because it's Saturn to a planet in detriment. Now, more recently, as many of you know, we've had Saturn in Capricorn. And while Saturn was in Capricorn, this individual experienced Saturn opposing the moon in their chart. Now, this was a very different experience for them. This was a time of some professional success where they were at a very kind of exclusive privileged role within their industry. There was an international kind of expat connection to their experiences during this time. They developed a new commitment to self-care and their physical health and fitness. They did experience a little bit of separation from their loved ones and their family. But for the most part, this individual feels like they were really able to achieve something that they were quite proud of during this particular transit. And this is a little more recent. Of course, we know Saturn was going through this particular part of the sky in 2020. I think the first part of 2020 primarily, but this was sort of a theme for them throughout the year, calendar year 2020, which was difficult for many of us for many reasons. But in the context of this individual's lived experience, they were able to really kind of achieve something that they could be proud of. So what made this, how did we get those topics here? Well, we know we're going to get topics to do with some sort of international or global experience because this is a planet in the 9th house. It's also the planet that rules the 9th house. The moon is a planet in the chart that definitely speaks to our physical health and vitality. So when you have Saturn conjunct, square, or opposite the moon, stuff will come up about your physical body, about what's not working, about what's connected to you aging, and about the things that you might need to be more organized about from a maintenance or a prevention perspective. One of the reasons that really speaks to this sense of like achievement or outcome, like productive outcome for this person, is that the moon in their chart is in rulership. The moon is at home in its home sign of Cancer. And so with transiting Saturn in aspect to a planet that is in rulership or exalted, maybe even a planet that has triplicity strength, for those of you that work with that, you're more likely to get experiences that might still require effort and dedication and hard work. It's still a Saturn transit, but you may be more, it might be for an experience that you've chosen, that you're proud to be involved in, or that you're more willingly engaging with. And that's the difference of the condition of the natal planet that Saturn is activating. Now, it's still an opposition, and this person was still, like many of us, I guess, in 2020, not able to see some of their dearest family members as much as they actually weren't able to see them for the whole year. And so we still see some of that kind of barrier of Saturn to the moon coming in, of not having the emotional support and connection that you might like. Now, that was partly because this individual's choice to do this thing, but they still had to deal with a quality of that sense of being a little disconnected or isolated from loved ones. And that's a very common Saturn moon transit experience. We're going to say a little bit more about Saturn in aspect by transit to all the visible planets shortly, but I wanted to just set us up with this example as we got going, so you could have a sense of some of the things of what I'm talking about. In this piece, I was also able to really illustrate for you the importance of the house rulers and how they lead to topics that we work with in a transit. It's one of the reasons why using this house rulership model is so helpful to enable you to be more specific about which parts of the chart, and therefore which parts of the life, are really being pressured and kind of changed through the timeline of the Saturn transit. So if Saturn is transiting Mars in your natal chart, make sure you include the topics of the Aries and Scorpio houses in your interpretation. If Saturn is transiting Mercury, just like in the example we looked at, do include the topics of the houses where you have Gemini and Virgo. If Saturn is transiting the moon, just like in the chart we looked at, make sure you include the topics of the Cancer house. If Saturn is transiting Venus in your chart, make sure you include the topics of your Taurus and Libra houses. For the Sun, we look to the Leo house. And for Jupiter, we're going to include the topics of the Sagittarius and Pisces houses as well. So I'm hoping that piece is getting a little more self-explanatory as we work through our material together, and it will really transform your transit forecasting skills. Some of the, let's have a quick look here. Look at me timing back. I don't know that I'll read through all of these points here. We're going to pull all of these out as we look at Saturn transiting each planet. But here are some phrases and concepts that you can incorporate into your Saturn transit predictive information. Saturn is really going to help you explore the rewards and consequences of past choices or past inaction, if you like. And in many ways, when we're in a Saturn transit, it's like the chickens come home to roost, so to speak. And that thing that you worked hard for 5 or 7 years ago, you're now reaping the rewards of. But that thing that you knew was a bit of an issue 5 or 7 years ago that you didn't quite get to doing what you thought you would like to about it, that's now back and needs your full attention. So the other piece with Saturn transits is they can really bring up this idea of endings and beginnings, that time is up or that the time is now. And one of the best ways to care for yourself through a Saturn transit, as we mentioned, is to take your time, to slow down, and to create a lot more space. So with those things said, let's turn our attention to Saturn transiting the planets individually. Okay. All right. So Saturn to the Sun. Now, one of the reasons this image really struck me for this part of our presentation is that there's something about a Saturn transit to the Sun that really speaks to the core of what's inside you. So the idea here is what is inside you that has become unexpressed, or that has been neglected or ignored, or that has been papered over by other concerns or pressures. So when Saturn is conjunct or square or opposite the Sun, you are being asked to reconnect with the stuff that is inside you. And this can be a fear, that you are, you know, that is affecting you or that has been in your life for a long time. So when you're working with like a Saturn Sun transit, and this piece could come up in other Saturn transits too, sometimes there's a specific fear or worry or concern that has to emerge. Sometimes it's an identity that you want to bring forward. And I think that word identity is really important for Sun Saturn transits. The idea that it's time to redefine who you are. And we do that in many ways by establishing what we want to be known for or associated with, and what we don't want to be known for or what we want to distance ourselves from. And so part of Saturn transits to the sun, the redefining your identity process is very much about clarifying the kinds of qualities and characteristics that you would like to develop within yourself, and the kinds of qualities or characteristics that, or habits maybe, that you know you have that you would like to change or update. The part of the Saturn Sun transit is that the sun represents this kind of central organizing force in our charts and in our lives, and it does, we get that principle because that's what the sun does in the solar system. So when Saturn transits the sun, there are things that, questions and matters and issues come up that help you reflect on and make necessary changes around what are you centering in your life? What is it that you are organizing your time and your energy around? And sometimes we think we know what that is, but we always get very clear on what it really is in a Saturn transit. And that clarity of seeing exactly what it is you are organizing things around, whether it's a person, a family, a job, a goal, that can help you decide whether that is as it should be or whether you would like to change that. One of the the qualities that the sun represents is this steadiness and this consistency. And so developing a quality of regularity is really important with the Saturn transit to the sun. Sometimes early in a Saturn transit, like particularly first or second hit, there are these pieces around, well, what's stopping me doing that? I'd like to be more consistent or regular with this thing, this goal or this person, but I find that I'm constantly not able to do that. Why is that? And there might be a boundary factor. There might be not being clear about limits factor or what have you. The sun is one of the forces of vitality in the chart, and Saturn transiting the sun can sometimes make us feel a bit older, can make us feel like we are aging, but it can also temporarily dim our vital forces so that a health condition might flare up, or a health issue we've never had before might become something we have to deal with. So if we think about Saturn as limits and the sun as vital forces, we might be learning about what inhibits the vital forces within ourselves and how we need to better manage that so we're not as diminished by different things. The sun, of course, is about light and about visibility, and Saturn is about darkness or about not being seen. And there are times when, we're dealing with a Saturn Sun transit where we're trying to redefine who gets to see us and what is it that we want to show them. And are we trying to be seen in a situation where we are not being attended to? And so sometimes we need to really kind of push or fight so that we can be acknowledged for, the important presence that we are. Sometimes we see that we are being diminished by a person or a situation, and that feeds into our choice about whether we want to stay engaged in that situation or not. Some of the questions to think about when you're having a Saturn transit to the sun are, what is it that you want to express? How would you like to go about that? And what is it that's stopping you doing that, if you like? What is it that is preventing you expressing or even leading? We know that the sun is one of the planets about leading and growing. So how is it that that what you're becoming aware of in your Saturn transit is cluing you in to something that is blocking your light? Now, the other side of this is that there are times in Sun Saturn transits where we're actually called to step up and take on much greater responsibility. We're called to be a leader, and we may have to think about what are the goals that we might have if we are to be this central organizing leader person. How would we like to guide or inspire others? And so there's a very profound internal kind of processing that goes on, like a digesting with Saturn in aspect to the sun. It's also important to think about the topics of the Leo house in your birth chart and the topics that the house is in the natal chart. So there's two primary two sets of house topics that we want to make sure we factor in here. Wherever you have Leo in your chart and the topics that the house, the sun falls in. So these are some of the keywords and concepts that will help you navigate through a Saturn transit to the sun. These types of transits will be especially important for people who are born in the daytime. So if the sun is your sect light, and in those instances, transits from Saturn to the sun can impact on career and professional direction as well. If you have a Leo ascendant where the sun is the ascendant guiding planet or ruling planet, then these Saturn transits to the sun become really important. So on the positive side, a transit from Saturn to the sun can activate leadership potential, can clarify a sense of identity and sometimes integrity, which can help you more firmly focus on what's important to you. In some of the more stressful expressions of transiting Saturn to the sun, this can create like a flatness or even a melancholy where we might not have the vital forces that we normally do. We might be flat or darker, and when I say dark, I'm using that word from a symbolic perspective to do with Saturn. If you're not bright, you're dark. And so you're inwards or you're slower or you're withdrawn. You're engaging with the archetype of the hermit, if you like. And so these are things to find a way to honor when you're in a Saturn transit with the sun so that you are not judging it as a negative. I don't think that Saturn transits are meant to be difficult or cause problems. I think that they really are intended to help you get to know yourself and help you get to better advocate for the things that really create security for you. And in the context of the sun, to help you advocate for the things that will allow you to shine to your best potential. Okay, so that's Saturn transits to the sun. Let's have a look at Saturn transits to the moon. And we have a couple of examples that we can bring in if we have time here. All right. So let's talk about this. Many of you will be thinking about Saturn transits to the moon in regards to emotions and emotional state. That is very, very true. But don't forget the physical body. So the moon is one of the main planets we use in health and medical astrology to talk about what's going on with our physical vessels. So Saturn transits to the moon can bring up both physical things as well as emotional things. I also just saw a comment there about somebody who's just experienced Saturn transits as being plain destructive and mean. And sometimes that happens. It's not as though you failed your Saturn transit if you didn't have a great outcome. Sometimes they are a little bit tests of endurance. It's a little tricky to kind of cover off everybody's unique experience because the condition of the natal planet receiving the Saturn transit is really going to speak to a lot of your personal experiences. Somebody's saying they had a big surgery when Saturn was conjunct their moon, which definitely makes sense. And that would have some physical implication and some emotional implication as well. So keeping in mind that the body is going to be part of the Saturn transit to the moon, we could be dealing with limits or challenges or reductions to our physical health and vitality. Some of those will be age related and some of those will just be simply a little challenging. There can be a quality of rededicating yourself to caring for your body, as we saw in our earlier example. And what that can look like for you, or what that looks like for each of us, might be different. For some of us, caring for our body means eating a certain type of dietary protocol. For some of us, it means making sure we get a certain amount of movement. For some of us, the sleep factor is really important. Now, all of those things are also going to contribute to your emotional well-being. So they do go hand in hand here. With Saturn transits to the moon, it's very common for stuff to come up around your home and your living situation. And there's a big piece to process through here with Saturn to the moon around how suitable is your home and living situation for your current and sort of future projected circumstances. Like, do you have a big family home and have all the kids moved out and it's time to downsize? Or are you starting a family and you're going to need more space than what you have? Maybe you're at a position in your life where you're ready to take on the responsibility of a mortgage or home ownership, or you just want to move to a larger flat that you're renting and you're going to commit more of your money or your income to your living or housing allowance. So whether we go up or down depends on your personal chart, but it's very common to do some restructuring around our home and our living situation. If we're not moving under a Saturn moon transit, there can be some sort of repairs or maintenance that are required to our home situation. Family dynamics are very common to come up under Saturn moon, especially things to do with mother or mothering. That could be you as mother if you have children. It could be you as a caring parent if you have children. It could be to do with your mother or to do with one of your parents. So it's, with the moon, we often go to the feminine with the parent, but it is not always as simple as that. We can find ourselves in a mothering type role for an aging parent, whichever parent that might be. There can be what I call this transfer of responsibility within family dynamics, where either and keep in mind that when family comes up with Saturn moon, it can either be the family that you've created, like your children and your lineage, or it can be the family you came from, your parents, elderly aunts or grandparents or what have you. And sometimes the transfer of responsibility is really obvious. Like, my child's now 10 and they're going to do a load of laundry once a week or cook a simple dinner once a week, whatever's age appropriate. Maybe it is that your parent used to be able to manage their own finances, but now they can't. And that's a burden that you're wanting to pick up for a period of time. So we're thinking about how we are dedicated to working on behalf of our family, and we're reassessing, is this reasonable? Is this maybe hard, but it's something that I'm choosing to do or feel like I have to do? It won't be easy. In my very humble opinion, in my work with clients, Saturn transiting the moon is one of the most difficult types of transits that we do have. And so I'm referring here to Saturn conjunct, square, or opposite the moon. It does tend to bring a very melancholy quality to our emotional being. We are dealing with so much about vulnerability and safety, some of these core survival instinctive needs. Matters to do with the past, to do with our childhood, to do with pain that we've experienced previously. All of this stuff can kind of come up for review or healing or processing when we're in a Saturn moon transits. So hopefully this is making sense. I can see a lot of comments here. I want to mention that specifically in the case of the moon only, the transiting Saturn conjunction to the moon is considered to be so important and incredibly difficult that in the Indian traditions of astrology, they give it its own special transit name, which is something called the SurteesSaturnTransits. And that looks at something more than what we're talking about now. It covers a longer time frame than just Saturn transiting conjunct the moon, but that's the center of that piece. So the Saturn conjunction to the moon or to any planet will certainly be the most intense expression of Saturn coming to that planet. And so you tend to get more extreme expressions of Saturn transit experiences when Saturn is conjunct your planet versus when it's square or opposite. So Bianca's saying everything you say, it's really right on. Crystal's saying, oh my God, I'm not looking forward to this. My moon's at 25 Aquarius. I do work with clients when Saturn is applying to the moon or coming up. And we talk in many ways, you'll probably be feeling a part of it. Like if you have your moon in Aquarius now, you'll already be feeling the vibe and the impact of this Saturn transit. Not fully, but you're starting to get a sense of it already. Saturn tends to bring to kind of the forefront of our mind as a priority topics and matters that we have known about for some time, that we have known is going to need our attention, and that we have known we need to do something different or better around. And when you get into that exact piece of Saturn making the conjunction, the square, or the opposition to the moon or to the other planet, it's time to actually address it, to have the hard conversation, to be honest with yourself, those types of things. You also want to bring in the topics of the Cancer house in your chart. And for some people, this is very, very literal, that the effort or the challenge or the weightiness of Saturn transiting the moon really shows up as a matter that is much more intensive to do with the topics of the Cancer part of your chart. So I'm going to do, I want to do two very brief examples that I actually think have a quality of showing how you can reclaim a level of protection for yourself, or a level maybe even, well, in one example, I don't know about the other one so much, but you might find that you're in, with Saturn to the moon, you could be getting responsibility. And if it's a responsibility you want, then you're just working really hard through that. Okay. So, quick question here. If the moon is in the 7th house, can it represent the partner's mother? It could, but it could also talk about an emotional matter that is your partner's. So you're a partner dealing with emotional stress. Maybe it's to do with their mum, but it could be for something else as well. Okay, so let's take a quick look here. Hopefully we can do these charts relatively briefly. So Kamala Harris has the moon in late Aries. In fact, she has the moon in late Aries and the sun in late Libra. So when transiting Saturn was going through late Capricorn throughout 2020, there were 2 different Saturn transits going on there. And, this is not necessarily asking you to speak or consider this chart from the perspective of your personal politics, but more from a position of what is this timing bringing to the forefront in this individual's life. And the moon is particularly important in this chart because it is what's called the sect light. This is somebody who's born at nighttime after the sun has set. And the moon becomes literally one of the guiding lights in the chart. And so the timeline in 2020 was that Saturn was square the moon in February, in July and August, and then again in November. Now, there was a lot of speculation about would she be involved with the presidential race in 2020 early in the year, but that wasn't clarified until that July-August period when we had the second exact activation. The final activation in November was the election then. And it's not to say that everybody having a Saturn moon transit where the moon is the sect light is going to be given a leadership position of some prominence, but it does talk about an increase of responsibility. And we could only imagine from the individual's perspective, the quality of perhaps stress or pressure that you might feel when you are being considered for a prestigious type position. So it's very easy to try and focus on specifics here, which is okay. But I'm also trying to think about maybe you're up for promotion at work, or maybe you're trying to get a job that's in a higher pay grade than what you've done before. So some of the Saturn transit stuff, which isn't necessarily Harris's experience, but is in general, is what is it that you think you're ready for? And what is it that you would like to take on? Now, the moon in Aries loves a challenge. And so if you have a moon in a fire sign or moon in Aries like this, your Saturn moon transit might bring something that is a little bit more complex or competitive to the forefront. So we do factor in the natal chart there as well. Second quick chart here to have a look at is Britney Spears. And Britney has the moon in Aquarius, which I imagine many of you listening do as well. And many of you know that she has been in these ongoing court battles for some time to try to reclaim a sense of agency or the ability to make choices for herself. And one little piece that stuck out with me when this was in the press recently was that there was this sense that she didn't realize that she could say no, or that she could push back. And look, I haven't spoken to Britney Spears personally. I have no idea, how truthful that statement may or may not be. But it was an interesting expression of the idea of a Saturn moon transit. Where we're sometimes in situations that become increasingly uncomfortable or difficult for us to bear or to manage. And Saturn gets to the moon, and we sort of like there's a line being drawn in the sand. We're reaching our limit, we're reaching the end of the process. And something can shift inside us where we find a quality of strength or resiliency that we didn't know we had, or that we didn't realize was inside us. And then that idea of like pushing back, saying no, or saying stop. These are some of the symbolic things that come forward. And I think that's really appropriate with Saturn moon stuff, where we're often in caretaker mode or looking after others mode or trying to manage our survival instincts mode. And we have to redefine what is a healthy, functional, or sustainable way to do that. In the context of Britney Spears' chart, the moon rules the Cancer midheaven. And there may be a piece to this for her, which is about wanting to reclaim a sense of, I want to be in charge of where my life is going. We often think of the midheaven as career only, but the midheaven is life direction and how we are moving forward through our life. And this Saturn moon, maybe for her, could be about, I want to take responsibility for that. And anytime we take responsibility for something, we are also, whether we realize it or not, we are choosing to manage or deal with the consequences of taking that responsibility on. So there's just a couple of little ways to think about that Saturn moon stuff. It's a really big transit. It can bring up some inner child bits and bobs. And so there can be some healing or reparenting required. And I really encourage clients to be very tender with themselves, to kind of treat yourself like you would a young child when you're in a Saturn transit to the moon. You don't feel like you want to do that, that's okay. We don't have to do it now. We can delay it, or we are allowed to say no. All of those kinds of things that, in an ideal family environment, you would learn from a caring or present parent. Okay, so let's talk about Saturn transits to Mercury. Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure we did a quick time check. These are really interesting transits, much more significant, I think, than they're given credit for. We are often dealing with very weighty choices. And one thing clients grapple a lot with in a Saturn moon transit is a Saturn Mercury transit, is this sense of, I have to get it right. I know I have to make this decision. It's got long-term consequences and I better get it right. So there can be a lot of stress that comes up with the Saturn Mercury transit. Sometimes that stress is like appropriate to the situation because you're doing some sort of tertiary level study where you've gone back to do a master's or a PhD program. And it's like, well, yeah, it makes sense that you're stressed because of a mercurial thing. You might be studying, writing, editing, or teaching. It's still stressful, but it's sort of in a commensurate way to the situation. Other things with Saturn Mercury transits are like formal documents. So legal documents, formal documents, or final paperwork. So contractual things. Weirdly, I have started to, this is sort of something from an observational perspective in the client consulting room. I do notice that Saturn Mercury transits sometimes really define the formal divorce piece of a relationship separation. That, when you are, for any of you who have counseled anyone or been through the process of a separation, like a marriage dissolution, the separation, the divorce, it's by nature a long process. It is a legal process, and there is a lot of documents that need to be signed through it. So the separation could come about through a variety of transits, but the piece where you are signing sort of the final legal documents, that like official divorce part, which is like the last piece of the process, that has correlated to Saturn transits to Mercury, conjunctions, squares, or oppositions in many clients' charts. it is going to be a cycle where communication is up in the air. So you're either struggling with communication, you're trying to master communication, you're trying to get better at being clear or firm with your communication. So it's possible to develop some kind of mental mastery with Saturn transits to Mercury, but sometimes it's just a really stressful time in our brains while we're trying to figure out some larger stuff that's got a bigger sort of weighty quality to it. Somebody's saying in the chat, Christina, that Saturn is square her Mercury and there's protracted legal stuff to do with selling her house. And that's very common for a Saturn Mercury thing. So yes, hopefully that's part of what you're just keeping in mind. Also, the topics of the Gemini and Virgo houses, as we saw in that first example. A question here from Laurie. I was born with Saturn opposite my moon. So does that mean every 7 years may bring up more intense repeats of lessons around health, isolation from family? Whether you have Saturn in aspect to the moon or not, everybody has Saturn make a tricky aspect to the moon every 7 years. So we've all done it lots of times, and we'll all have many more times to navigate that ahead. In theory, the older we get, the more we know ourselves, the better we understand what our personal definition of protection and safety means, the better we develop our own sense of vulnerability and the situations where it's appropriate to be vulnerable in, the more we're able to kind of catch and work with Saturn moon situations before they get out of hand. One thing that I see a lot, if you do have like moon Saturn in the natal chart or Mercury Saturn in the natal chart, so it's a little bit stronger when you have the 7-year activations, that you will sometimes, when you have the current transit as a grown person in your 30s or 40s or 70s, you're sometimes doing some healing about the original events that were tied to that natal aspect. So hopefully that helps with that piece there. Okay. Khalid's asking, which transits would you say have a greater bearing on emotional instability, Saturn moon or Saturn Mercury? Saturn moon, for sure. I think Saturn Mercury really brings us into the mental health mindset space. And it's a very subtle difference to be like, is it more like, is it when something's stressful, is it stressful because our brain is churning or because our belly is hurting? And it's a very subtle distinction. It's possible to work with a distinction between the two, but if you're, from a lived experience, both of them can be uncomfortable in slightly different ways. So hopefully that helps with that piece there. Okay, so we did look at a Saturn transit to Mercury in our early example. So let's go to Saturn-Venus transits, everybody's favorites to worry about and to concern about. Okay, so I actually think Saturn transits to Venus. So I think Saturn moon transits are some of the more difficult types of transits we can have. There's such a diametrically opposed tone and quality to the moon and to Saturn that when they have to work together, it tends to be that the moon comes off second best. But Venus, the one thing Venus and Saturn both share is that they're both interested in building things that last. And so even though Venus might have to grapple with some more weighty or difficult or uncomfortable topics, there is a little bit of a shared kind of unspoken thing that Saturn and Venus have. Okay, so love stuff comes up with Saturn transits to Venus. You may see that there is some restructuring or reorganizing about commitments and choices and the kinds of challenges that you're willing to work through in your close relationships. But the one piece that I don't think we talk about enough with Saturn transits to Venus is how that it really brings up your own sense of self-love, your own sense of self-worth, your own sense of self-value. Because one of the biggest things that I talk about with Saturn Venus transits to clients is this quality of deservedness. And what we mean by that is that sometimes we tolerate or put up with or accept situations, whether it's with a colleague, a friend, a family member, or a romantic partner, we find ourselves in situations that we seem to be trying to make work that are really not good for us. And we have a Saturn transit to our Venus, and that can bring up a lot of old stuff about how you might have learned as a child that your deservingness is dependent on your work or your willingness to please or your ability to make other people happy. And we redefine those things in a transit from Saturn to Venus so that we are centering ourselves rather than the other person. With Saturn transit to the Venus, what you're trying to kind of look almost be pushed in the most uncomfortable ways is the idea of what is it that would give me pleasure in this situation? Where would I feel safe in context to this other person? Do I feel safe getting closer, or do I feel more safe if I'm further away? And further away might be less available or only seeing them with other people, or maybe you might be so far away that you're actually not interacting with them anymore. And so the key with Saturn to Venus is to almost redefine what relating looks like for you in a way that you now have some capacity around at whatever your current age and stage of life might be. So that the way you would have worked with a Saturn Venus transit in your 20s is 1,000 times different than you will work with it in your 50s or in your 70s, because the lived experience from one Saturn Venus transit to the other gives you something that you draw on as you make your new choices in your current Saturn Venus transit. So developing a sense of self-love or deservingness or worthiness, that you don't have to do anything. You don't have to work to be well cared for. And, if you're not getting the things that you're starting to realize that you deserve or that you're worthy of, that prompts the restructuring and the conversations about, well, how can we change this? And are you someone who's willing to change this with me? And things like that. Now, I've just gone through a Saturn Venus transit myself, and there were pieces of this, but one of the biggest topics that I was working with was the topic of one of my Venus houses in the chart. So thinking about the topics of the Taurus house and the Libra house in your chart. And a very simple example is that I have a Venus ruled sign on the third house in my chart. I have Taurus on the third. And as I went through a Saturn Venus transit, one of my siblings went through a hugely horrible experience. And it wasn't my horrible experience, but it was a thing they were dealing with that was difficult, that we were supporting them around. And so to be as specific as you can be, don't forget the topics of the Taurus and the Libra parts of your chart. Now, we've got an example here, a client example that I want to share. So this client, this is actually very real time. This client has Venus in Taurus, as you can see. And of course, like everybody, this client is experiencing Saturn going through Aquarius. And for this client, that is Saturn's in the second house, and it's squaring the Venus. I can see the Mars right there. For teaching purposes, I just want to focus on the specific piece of this transit that is the Venus for them. What are the topics of Venus for this person? Venus is in the fifth house, so we know it's going to be a little bit about kids. We know that Venus rules the fifth house because the sign Taurus is on the fifth house cusp. And Venus is also the primary planet in the chart responsible for career because we have a Libra midheaven. So this person has been in lockdown with their children, and they've loved it. They have really enjoyed spending more time with their kids. This is somebody who previously worked, many, many hours a week and just wasn't able to be as an involved parent as they wanted to be. Now, this individual also was let go from their job as part of, the COVID situation where they are. And for a time, there was some concern about what that would mean for them. As things have unfolded, they have now landed a much better job for much better pay that they are thrilled about. So how is it for this client that some tough things have been going on, but they've had some really good outcomes or good experiences as a result? So what is it specifically about Venus in this chart for this person? This person has Venus in Taurus. So for them, Saturn transiting the Venus is like squeezing the good stuff about a planet in rulership out into their life. So, yes, you are at home with your kids, and many of us were with lockdown over the last 18 months to 2 years. But for this person, that was a sweet blessing, if you like. It was Venus in Taurus. Now, they did lose their job, transiting Saturn, squaring the planet ruling the midheaven. They weren't out of work for very long, and they have ended up with a much better job with better hours for more money than they had before. So they've got a better 10th house experience coming through for them as a result of this transit. Now, they've had to go through the endings and beginnings of Saturn squaring the Venus and how we're going to make the changes. But because that Venus there, she was able to operate from a place of, what am I worth? What do I deserve? I'm going to have that conversation and ask for the salary that would be amazing to get. And luckily for her, she was able to get it. So Saturn Venus transits or Saturn Mercury, any Saturn transit, some of them will have really positive outcomes, even as you navigate, the stress of Saturn as you go. And so for those of you who might be thinking, oh, I've got Venus in the 5th house and I have a different experience or different choices, you do have to think about the sign that your Venus is in and the aspects that she's making, those types of things. This isn't a perfect Venus because Mars is right there, but it's a pretty good Venus for her and has worked very well for her in this instance and historically as well. Okay, so that's probably enough on Venus. We've still got 2 planets I want to try and have a little look at before we finish today. So scooch ahead to Mars. Saturn transits to Mars. These are huge. And in fact, I probably didn't appreciate how much is associated with a Saturn Mars transit until I was talking with clients about them. And this type of transit, so whether Saturn is conjunct, square, or opposite Mars in your chart, brings up questions about the use of your energy. Are you putting your energy to push towards goals or outcomes that you're actually interested in or care about? Or are you kind of slogging along on a road doing a thing that you've kind of forgotten why you're there? So consider reassessing your goals. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Funnily enough, regardless of house rulership, I often see people reassessing professional pathways and professional commitments when they are going through a Saturn transit to Mars. So all of your long-term plans come up for review, and this can be a major reassessment about career and life direction. One of the big things that Saturn and Mars are at odds with each other about is that Mars wants results now, and Saturn is thinking about, what can I do to get results in 5 years' time? And when we're having a Saturn Mars transit, one of the things we have to adjust or change is the level of energy and time that is going towards long-term goals. So we have to learn things like self-regulation. We have to learn things like delayed gratification. We have to kind of understand that sometimes short-term pain for long-term gain is a really valuable strategy. So we're trying to think about, the viability of things in the present and whether whatever stress they're causing today is worth it based on the long-term expectation of what you're doing. And if things aren't adding up, then that's going to raise questions about whether you should be focusing on that. So my main work with, I've seen this question come up a few times, or this comment. My main work with clients around Saturn transits is usually to do with conjunctions, squares, or oppositions. Of course, transiting Saturn makes sextiles and trines to these planets as well. And you will tend to get softer, easier, or more manageable experiences. But most of what I'm talking about today is really speaking to the big Saturn transits, which relates to conjunctions, squares, or oppositions to the natal planets, just so we're all on the same page. With Saturn in aspect to natal Mars, you're going to be thinking about, how can I reduce drama or disturbances in my life? How do I need to figure out maturity or being the bigger person? That doesn't mean taking it or copying it on the chin. Sometimes it means, how do I set a limit here? How do I remove myself from this uncomfortable interaction or what have you? It's also very common in a Saturn transit to Mars to take on a project or a challenge of a much more substantial nature. So years ago, I had a client and I was like, wow, this Saturn Mars transit, this looks like it could be, really pressured and you might be like really drained, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm training for my first marathon. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's an appropriate level of it's a challenge to take on that is going to create space for the kind of pressure or stress, and the challenge. Running a marathon is such an undertaking, and of course is going to leave you feeling tired or drained or physically very sore. So sometimes we see the outcomes there based on the experience. I had another client go through a very difficult pregnancy. Well, the pregnancy was okay, but it was the labor and the delivery that was really difficult. And they were having a Saturn transit to their Mars. And they knew going in that there was a complication with the way the baby was and where the placenta was. And they knew they were going to have a cesarean section. And while it was, there was no concern that the baby and she wouldn't come through fine, but it was going to be much more of a technical, complex type of C-section than the kind of typical C-section. And so that's another sort of Saturn Marsy thing, is that you're doing your thing, taking on a fitness challenge or having a baby, and it might be a little more complicated or a little bit more demanding. There's a gravitas to it that may be atypical from what other people could be doing in that situation. There is a piece of tiredness. So Mars is a place where we get that kind of fire in the belly or the fuel coming in from. And so sometimes we are feeling like we don't have that spark inside of us. And so part of the Saturn Mars transit can be, if I have less energy and drive, or my enthusiasm is less or reduced for this transit time, what is it that I have to do? Or what is it that it is most important that I do? Because if we know going in, we're not going to have time for all the fun extras, that can, again, classic Saturn transit style, bring you back to what is the most important things in this 8 or 9 month time frame that you need to put energy into, that you need to make a decision around. So that's something to think about. And of course, the topics of the Aries and Scorpio houses. So we can bring those topics in as well. Now we've got one other client example we'll do succinctly, and then we'll look at Saturn transits to Jupiter. I can see we've got some questions that when we should have some time to look at that. I don't work with the in conjunct aspect as a more traditionally styled or inclined astrologer. That's a different type of thing in traditional astrologer. So I personally don't work with that. And yes, we did do a previous webinar where we looked at Saturn transiting through the houses, and we spoke to what to expect from each of those previously. Material about Saturn in the natal chart or planets in the natal chart, that's all covered in my chart interpretation series of classes. You can find that on my website and the Become an Astrologer page. You can also find all of those classes on the Astrology University website as well. Okay, so in this client's chart, oh, getting too excited, I'm throwing my microphone around. We have Mars fulfilling a technical role in the chart known as the out of sect malefic. So hopefully that phrase is familiar to you. And if not, you'll definitely want to check out some of my teaching, Intro to Traditional Astrology or Counseling Skills for Challenging Aspects, where you get more information on those features, in addition, of course, to the chart interpretation courses. Basically, Mars in a day chart or Saturn in a night chart is that out of sect malefic planet. And it's a planet that comes with a little bit more of a prickly, problematic tone to it. Now, like any of you with planets in Aquarius, this client is experiencing transiting Saturn go over that Mars there. And a couple of things have come up for this client. There has been an issue with a friend dealing with a level. So the friend is going through an incredibly difficult time, and that has caused some concern for the client. They're worried about how much they can do, how can they help? And of course, they're just naturally very concerned and worried for their friend. So because this transit is happening inside the 11th house, we know that one of the pressure points or the sources, the sore spot or the kind of stress point is going to be tied to a friend situation. Mars in this chart also rules the ascendant. And this client has also been feeling some of that weariness, the first house being the body and the identity. So they're grappling with how much energy do they have? And I've built up this big thing in my life and in my career. And do I want to keep going with it? Or do I consolidate and kind of put things into a more simple form? Now, the jury's still out on what they're going to decide because the timeline of the transit still has some months to run, but they're continuing to research and work through their options, and also being more realistic about how much energy they have, knowing that we've got this kind of contraction Saturn Mars cycle, which is going to take away enthusiasm or motivation, or at least minimize and reduce it for a period of time. So there's a brief example there. And I know we could talk about each of these in so much depth and detail. We aren't covering the ascendant today. We talked about that in the previous webinar. Yes, the first pass of the transit is typically the hardest. So if you're having the classic sort of first, second, third hit, the first is usually the most difficult. And that applies not just to Saturn transits, but all transits. And the reason for that is the first time a transiting planet comes in, it's sort of hitting up something in your chart that is not normally dealing with that influence. And there's a little bit of a, oh my gosh, I've got to think about this differently or rearrange that, or, oh, that's not the way I thought it was. There's a fault line here that I'm going to have to repair or what have you. So yes, the first hit is always the most difficult. I tend to use an exact orb for transits and timing. So I really look at when is Saturn exactly conjunct the Mars or square the moon or opposite the Venus. Maybe add a few weeks of build up before the first hit. But the timeline that I share when I'm talking about this 8 to 9 month is from when the first exact hit happens to when the third exact hit finishes. So hopefully that helps that. Okay. There are some longer questions, which I'll save for the end. Okay, so let us move to our Saturn-Jupiter transits. Now, I wanted to include these because they're really important in the context of client chart and experiences, and they're probably more important in your chart than you realize. When Saturn transits to your Jupiter, you are going to be questioning things to do with meaning and purpose. You're going to be sort of wondering, why are things the way they are? Where did my joy go, or where does it come from? And why am I not doing more of the things that really matter to me? Both Saturn and Jupiter have a lot to do with larger events and plans. So when you're having a Saturn transit to Jupiter, you're not just thinking about, where do I go for dinner this weekend, or what hike do I want to do this month? You're thinking about the suitability from both a practical but also a fulfillment perspective of major things in your life, like where you live, your career, your relationships, the way you interact with family, whether you have time and space for hobbies and things like that. So bigger, more substantial topics will come up with Saturn, Jupiter that have this sort of longer ongoing thing. Jupiter is one of the traditional planets to do with wealth and abundance in the chart. And so you will often be kind of dealing with some monetary or wealth, long-term wealth planning. In addition to that, of course, we need to address the topics of the Sagittarius and the Pisces houses in our chart. Saturn and Jupiter work in very different ways, but they both think about the bigger things in our lives. And when Saturn comes to Jupiter, we have to get a little bit more grounded, a little bit more practical about some of the big adventures or the big dreams. We want to kind of bring them into a reasonable or reachable space. So the chart that I want to share with you for this example is a chart from a client who has Jupiter in early Capricorn. So yes, so this it speaks to the year 2018 when transiting Saturn was coming into Capricorn and going over Jupiter in their chart. Now, remembering what we talked about earlier, Jupiter is in the fall condition in this chart. Another way that I think about Saturn transiting a planet in detriment or fall is that there might be a bit of a fault line in your life that you perhaps are aware of and you try to manage as best you can. And then the Saturn transit to this planet in detriment or fall comes along and you realize that you're managing or coping or making do skills about this fault line are actually not going to be enough, and a more substantial or permanent fix or repair is required. So that's what we're working through. In this client's chart, we have Jupiter in the second. So we would expect to see some monetary, financial income stuff. And we can see that they have a Sag ascendant. So that Saturn on Jupiter is also going to bring up some of those topics to do with identity, to do with their physical body, those types of things. So this coincided with them making the choice to separate from their husband. And it's really interesting to me working with clients how often major ascendant or ascendant ruling planet stuff brings up big relationship developments. It's not a surprise when you think about how much the person that we're in an intimate relationship with, how much they affect our sense of identity or even our physical well-being. I've worked with clients who have had long-running health issues that have majorly improved as they have stepped out of relationships that were really difficult for them. So there's a real link, of course, between those things. So Saturn conjunct Jupiter, and they kind of got real with themselves about the fact that things weren't great in their marriage. They hadn't been good for a while. And this was the separation where they moved into separate homes, basically. Well, she moved out and he stayed in, I think, for the time being. She decided to stop drinking alcohol. She realized that that was something that she wasn't in, she wouldn't have defined herself as an alcoholic. And I think that was a fair definition, that she wasn't in that space, but she realized that she was drinking so much that she wasn't really herself, or she wasn't making as clear choices. And isn't that a lovely expression of that Saturnian kind of restriction or restraint? I'm going to stop doing this thing that I don't think is having a good impact on me. It's a really productive use of Saturn transiting the ascendant, if you missed that last time, the ruling planet of the ascendant, or even to the moon. You know, in those types of transits, we want to be really like quality controlling what we're taking into our body. And for her, this prompted this sort of 12-month long no alcohol period, which she actually has decided to continue because she's just found that she's much more she just likes herself better this way. And there was a really difficult financial reality check that she got about her business that hit home, that things weren't as viable. There was a fault line there about the business's finances that has taken or took her quite some time and energy to fix and to repair. Now, keep in mind that if Jupiter in your chart is in Cancer or Pisces or Sagittarius, where it's exalted or in rulership, you might have some more kind of productive, accumulative experiences from your Saturn-Jupiter transit. Part of her specific experiences have to do with the condition of Jupiter in her specific birth chart. But hopefully this is giving you a sense of how you can say some meaningful and specific forecasts for Saturn transits based on the house rulership and the qualities of the planets that we're working with. In terms of, you know, your own process and reflection, Saturn transits, I think, are really about bringing us clarity. Now, sometimes we don't like what we see, and that's tough. I'm not going to lie. But at least with a Saturn transit, you have started to see things, or it's like there are no rose-colored glasses here. You are seeing things as they are. And if you can like accept the facts and kind of sort of sit with the reality, you will be able to make some really nourishing choices that are in your best long-term interests. A Saturn transit to a planet in your chart, remember that each planet is a part of your being, and it represents dreams and fears. It might represent a talent or a weak spot. It represents something that you already know about yourself. And when the Saturn transit comes to that planet, you get to bring a new quality of mastery. You get to know, like the client who stopped drinking, for instance, you get to know that drinking's not good for you. And I think I might try not doing that. Or like the client with the Saturn-Venus transit, you get to sort of define your worth, and you sort of set an expectation that that's where you will be met by others out in the world. You will develop strength and backbone. That is something that you will get through a Saturn transit, even if you think that's not possible because you're barely getting by when you're in a Saturn transit. I've been in Saturn transits like this. And so I know that we don't always feel the strength and resilience that's building in us during a Saturn transit while we're in it. But sometimes shortly when we come out of that exact degree-based transit, we're like, wow, I managed that. I got myself through that, or I built that, or whatever it happens to be. These are cycles of maturity. And the primary way of tracking your progress with that is your internal growth and progress. Sure, there might be external things that are changing, but it's less about how you're being defined externally and more about how you're coming to that deeper wisdom and that deeper understanding of who you are and what you really need. It's helping you understand what's necessary for you. And we're going to finish on a quote that kind of acknowledges that shortly. There is a discovery cycle. There's a discovery quality to Saturn transits where you get to understand more about where you hurt and how you can care for that, or what you have the potential for and how you can get that out in the world. The only person that you have to try and do better by or be better for at the end of the day is yourself, and you have the ultimate responsibility there. And I think we get to come closer to those pieces about personal actualization through our Saturn transits. Tina's just saying there are Saturn transits. She loves them. They're an uncomfortable pain in the tush, but when you get out of them on the other side, wow. In the same way that, you might not love training every day, whether that's just walking for fitness or training for some sort of demanding event. But the feeling in your body of flexibility or strength that you get from a consistent period of effort is phenomenal. So that's what the Saturn transit is. It might be like weight training. I think somebody else had said that weight training for the psyche or the emotional, the inner parts of you. But Saturn will give you the rewards for the effort that you put in. For that, I am absolutely certain. And so the final little quote that I want to finish on is by Maya Angelou, who has plenty of Saturn aspects in her birth chart and certainly had plenty of Saturn aspects throughout her life. And this quote is, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And I think that's a huge piece of what our Saturn transits teach us, is how we can do better by and for ourselves. And why wouldn't we want to learn that so that we can live a more full, meaningful, but also safe life? Thank you so much for coming, everybody. We're going to have a few minutes for questions here. I can see there's a few in the chat list. I know that some of you have to rush off because we are a few minutes over our official end time. We're only going to be here for another 10 minutes or so doing questions. But if you do have to go, they'll all be on the recording. Hey, Tony.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That was so great. There were so many really rich examples, chart examples. So thanks for
I'm glad
compiling
they worked well.
those.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Oh, just brilliant. So good. So thank you so much. Well, we have a question here from Lori about different types of transiting aspects like trines, sextiles, quintiles. Do the themes still apply, but maybe create an opportunity? Can a trine make something happen quicker, even in a negative way?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think that the sextiles and the trines will tend to make things happen with a little bit less effort. So, Saturn squares or oppositions or conjunctions can have this real great effort quality. And so Saturn sextile or trine is like, you're doing something productive. It's not as challenging and you're moving through it more easily. Quintiles, inconjunct semi-sextiles, in traditional astrology, we treat them a little differently. So I wouldn't be able to comment on those in the way you're thinking of. So hopefully that helps. Thanks, Laurie.
Let's see. Anonymous says, in about 3 years, Saturn will be in my 9th house, conjunct natal Saturn. Basically, so we're not going to do like individual chart interpretations of specific aspects today, but this person's basically saying, I'm looking at this Saturn transit, and then I'm absolutely terrified. Is there a way to quote unquote handle this period?
Look, I can see the data there. And the piece, if you were my client, this is one thing you kind of sometimes have to learn with astrology, is to filter out the noise and focus on the heart of it. And in the example you've described, the heart of it is the Saturn-Mars transit, at least from my perspective in the style of astrology that I practice. So I would think about, what is Mars in your chart? What house is Mars in? What are the irritations or annoyances that you deal with as a result of your Mars? And I'm not saying the Saturn transit means there's going to be more of those, but I'd like you to figure out how you could manage those in a way that you are more taken care of. And I would really think about the topics of the Aries and the Scorpio parts in your chart, the houses, and to think about, am I up to date in those areas? Or do I know that there's something that I have been neglecting? I mean, if Aries or Scorpio rules your second or eighth house, like, are you up to date with money stuff, or do you need to get on top of that? So there can be some really practical expressions of our transits that we sometimes forget, but that's how I would guide you to work with that collection of things, is go straight to the heart, which is the Saturn Mars.
Thanks, Kelly. Maureen asked if you could describe a little bit of the difference between transiting opposition versus a conjunction.
Sure. So the transiting conjunction from Saturn or any other planet will be the most intense. So it tends to be the most dramatic or the most all-consuming. And the transiting square or opposition, I would put sort of then together. It is still very strong. And I know from a student perspective, sometimes we really want to understand, well, what's the difference between the two? But I can promise you, from a client or a lived experience perspective, it is still meaty and weighty and challenging and complex, whether it is the square, the opposition, or the conjunction. So you wouldn't really minimize or downplay any of those relative to the other, because they will all bring a sense of, they'll all bring events that have gravitas associated with them. Hopefully.
Thanks, Kelly. And Andrea asked about what orbs you use, and also can you analyze the difference in experience based on, I'm reading into the question here, applying and separating.
Yeah. Okay, so I tend to use exact orbs. So I would look at like Saturn exactly conjunct your planet. Like when I was talking about my Saturn Venus transit, I looked at the 3 months where Saturn was at the exact degree of my natal Venus. For orbs, I might add, I don't really have an orb in the traditional sense, but what I might add is a few weeks before the first exact hit. I'm like, you're starting to feel it, it's kicking in, and it's, and then it's full strength when we get the exact hit. But once Saturn passes the exact degree for the last time, it starts to slowly diminish in influence. And planetary transit energy and influence comes in and out, not like a light switch going off and on, but like a sunrise, where it gradually gets brighter and then it gradually gets darker and fades away. And so as soon as, like, if your natal planet's at 10 degrees, as soon as Saturn gets to 11 degrees and it's not coming back to the 10, you can start to breathe your sigh of relief, and you're into sort of recovery mode. Hopefully that helps. I know orbs can be tricky.
And a little bit on applying and separating.
Oh, the applying and separating. Yeah. So I guess I don't really use applying and separating. I mean, it's really important in the natal chart, but having some time before the first exact hit, that's your application. So I don't have an orb for that. I would just, for Saturn, use 3 or 4 weeks. And the separating is like when Saturn is coming away from the degree. So as soon as it's coming away from the degree, as soon as Saturn's in the next degree, that's like the separating piece, I guess. But maybe there's more to the question. If they need more, let me know.
All right. Sally asked if you could say a little bit about Saturn transits to stelliums.
I love questions like this. I have a stellium in my chart, and I've worked with clients who do. Break it down one by one, timeline each exact aspect. So, if we've got a planet at 8 degrees, at 10 degrees, at 15 degrees, and at 17 degrees, each of those planets is having its own timeline, and each of those planets is going to have its own sort of transit topics. So if it's Saturn Venus, we're going to do Saturn Venus stuff in this timeline. And then it's Saturn Moon, right? We're doing Saturn Moon stuff in this timeline. And maybe there's crossover, and then you're doing 2 things at once or 3 things at once. But break it down individually, because each planet being transited by Saturn is bringing something specific to the table that will need to be considered. hopefully that helps for anyone who has Aquarius stelliums or Taurus stelliums and are dealing with the current Saturn situation.
Lisa's wondering how she can bring in the teachings on combustion into an analysis of a Saturn transit, for instance, Saturn transit to a combust moon or any other planet that's combust.
Yeah, great question. So that would come in under the bit about where you consider the condition of the natal planet. So if a planet is combust, then we know that that planet has qualities of things being hidden, or maybe it's like where you don't always see things clearly. It might just represent a topic that you really struggle with in your life. And so if we know that it's tricky just based on the natal chart, it's likely to get a little bit more complicated or pressured or even stressful for the time frame of the transit. So that would add into, this could be a little bit more of a difficult Saturn transit because the planet is combust in the natal chart. So we'd add it in and weave it in that direction.
Thanks, Kelly. And an extension of that one, a Saturn transit to the sun in someone with a day chart versus an evening chart, how would you interpret those differences or those nuances?
Yeah, fantastic. So in a nighttime chart, Saturn is going to be the out of sect malefic. So he has the potential to be a little bit more problematic. And so you might find that a little bit more of an uncomfortable experience. Saturn transits in theory can be a little bit more productive or constructive for day chart, but you got to assess the natal planet itself, but they can be a little bit more stressful in a night chart. So that's how I would sort of speak to that.
Liz wants to know if a transit that Saturn transit that just makes one pass is easier or more intense.
I would say it's both. It is definitely more intense because a lot happens in a short space of time, but it is over more quickly. And in the case of some Saturn transits, that's a great thing.
And we'll just take this last one here from Mariah. Can we think about the last time we had the same Saturn transit and the themes we had back then? Are they going to surface again, but in a different way?
Great question. Short answer, yes. And the only thing to factor in is that, if you're having Saturn square Venus, actually, I think I know who this person is. So if you're having Saturn conjunct a planet coming up in the future, and you can think back to when that happened 30 years ago, you've got, yes, we might see some similar themes, but we have to remember that a lot changes in 30 years. We go from being a child to being an adult. We go from being a younger adult to being a more mature adult. And so as we get older, we tend to have more agency and, all going well, more influence over what's going on in our lives. So we're often able to manage or work with transits that we have in adulthood that we also had in childhood. We're often able to either guard against better or work with in a more productive way as we get older. There are some exceptions to that, but usually particularly with Saturn when it's on a 30-year interval. So yes, you certainly can take that approach.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Kelly. And thanks everybody for your great questions and your energy and attention today. We really appreciate you. I hope you enjoyed the material. Kelly, that's just a gorgeous scarf. I've just been sort of hypnotized by it for some reason. I love those colors. So
thank you.
Yeah.
This was a Euro purchase, and the quality of the stuff is just beautiful. It's like a special type of fabric. It's gorgeous. Thank you. I love it too. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. Actually, I just realized I'm kind of color coordinated.
You are. I love your
again.
shirt. Actually, Tony, and there's some Venus vibe today because I was like, Tony's got a really smart shirt. I mean, you always look smart, but I love the fabric and the design. We're all getting good juju. I think this is Jupiter vibes to help balance some Saturn or something.
Right?
Who knows?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Lightening it up here at the end, leaving you on a lighter note after some Saturn focus here and attention.
Yes.
Yes. Well, thanks again so much, everyone. And we will see you again next time. And until then, take good care.
Thanks, everyone.